The flip side for this commodity discussion, of course, is what's happening in grain markets and ethanol markets. And Owen Wagner, who is with LMC International, which is a UK-based agribusiness consulting firm, has agreed to come and give his perspective on some of those issues. So, Owen, if you'd join me, and please welcome Owen Wagner.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Bob. I don't have my name tag, and I appreciate the gatekeepers letting me in. I am who Bob says I am, and who I say I am. I didn't get lost and wander over from the scrapbooking convention down the hall. But just to expand a little bit on Bob's introduction, LMC Agribusiness Consultancy, as he mentioned, we've been around since 1980, based in Oxford in the United Kingdom. We're organized into different commodity teams and have offices in Southeast Asia, as well as a research office here in the US. I'm a little bit of an outlier because of my geography, and my primary focus in the company is on sugar and oil seeds. We have a dedicated biofuels team in the UK, but given my location and the obvious synergies across ag commodities and ethanol, it just made the most sense for me to come present this analysis here today. Just as an aside, when we're presenting to U.S. audiences, we do endeavor to present things in recognizable units, gallons, acres, tons, etc. But a couple of my UK-based colleagues, I noticed, slipped a few diagrams in metric. So I'll have to gently remind them that that's not how we keep records here in the colonies. So. Just a little bit of an overview of what it is I'm going to be covering today. We're going to begin with a bit of a backgrounder on the Brazilian ethanol sector and discuss some of the recent challenges. And I imagine that for a lot of the folks in this room, some of these slides are going to be a little bit remedial in nature. They're going to look familiar, but that said, I think this is going to be new material for some folks, and it's important just to make sure everyone's up to speed and that we're singing from the same hymn sheet, so to speak. So yeah, we'll talk a little bit about the Brazilian ethanol sector, some of the challenges, namely the lower gasoline prices that they face there, as well as increasing costs, and then a little bit, and then we'll gravitate toward the export sides of things and talk about how RFS uncertainty, which is a topic that's been well covered here, has also pinched export opportunities for Brazil into the U.S. Then we'll move on and we'll look at a sort of a benchmarking exercise. I think in the first part of this presentation, I don't want to give the impression that I'm bad-mouthing or being too hard on Brazil, because at the end of the day, both the U.S. and Brazil stack up extremely well against global competitors. I mean, costs are the lowest. Unfortunately, prices are also the lowest, or among the lowest in the U.S. and Brazil, which translates into margins that are not as good as say, one might see in the EU. More recently, the U.S. has benefited from falling feedstocks, while Brazil has not. I don't want to give Brazil a complete pass here, because that higher feedstock cost is due in part to their own lack of reinvestment in the cane stands in that country. Then we'll conclude the presentation by sort of moving on to an outlook for Brazil. There's considerable room for improvement in Brazilian costs. Some of those can be achieved relatively easily and quickly. Others will take time and money. And money is something that's in short supply right now for Brazilian millers. Fortunately, there's also been some favorable policy changes in Brazil that have sort of come to life in the last couple months. Nevertheless, for 2015, we see the uncertainty surrounding the RFS2, as well as cheap corn in the U.S. as being unsupportive of Brazilian ethanol shipments to the U.S. And then the flip side of that, of course, is that relatively cheap corn here in the U.S. and higher gasoline prices in Brazil than what we have here in the U.S. certainly open the window wider for further U.S. corn ethanol exports to Brazil. So I think certainly good news for most of the folks in this room. Here's just a brief overview of the Brazilian ethanol sector. This diagram shows the maturation of the industry since its inception in the mid-1970s. We like to kind of characterize it in terms of three phases. Phase one, which sort of began in the late 70s, spanning to the early 90s, was a boom in the sale of E100 vehicles. So these were vehicles that could really only be operated on the hydrous ethanol. Then phase two was a return to gasoline between the early 1990s and the mid 2000s. And then the present phase, although we may be entering a new one, we'll see how this policy shakes out, but this what was the flex fuel vehicle boom. And that line doesn't line up, I think, exactly where it should. It should begin, I think, say more in 2006, 2007. But during that period, you saw a rapid increase in the registration and purchase of these flex fuel vehicles. And I'd say, until recently, ignoring the events of the last 2 or 3 months, it seemed that the government desired to control gasoline prices. So they were allowing gasoline prices to increase incrementally internally. So this is the gasoline A price, but keeping the price that is passed on to consumers at flat levels by sort of rolling back various taxes. And the effect of that was to essentially encourage gasoline consumption at the sake of ethanol, and ultimately you had prices at which Brazilian ethanol producers couldn't compete. So you see that drop in the blue line that's taken place in the last couple years, and that's largely a reflection of newer Brazilian mills, ethanol-only Brazilian mills sort of dropping out of business in many cases. So, but like I said, there's been a few policy changes on the horizon that could come in to save the industry. This diagram just homing in a little bit on the flex fuel vehicle launch. What we've seen is, in the last 2 years, you've got between 3 and 3.5 million of flex fuel vehicles being registered and purchased in Brazil. When you compare that against the fleet at large, so including older vehicles, you've got something like 2/3 or 70% of cars on the road in Brazil are now flex fuel vehicles. So with that, you've got the situation in which most Brazilian motorists have a choice of what they want to fuel up with at the pump. The choice being E100, which is a hydrous product, and because of a lower energy content is capped somewhere typically between 70 and 75% of the price of gasoline. And then you have, of course, gasoline C, which is the blend of straight gasoline. Incidentally, about 1/5 of that is imported, mostly from the U.S., blended with an anhydrous product. And as I mentioned, the anhydrous blending began with pro-alcohol in 1976, and the Brazilian Congress has recently signaled that they're going to increase that blending level from 25% to 27%. Dilma Rousseff, the Brazilian president, was supposed to sign off on that, I believe, on Tuesday, but has not. So a lot of people are now, who were enthusiastic a couple weeks ago, are now wringing their hands a little bit about this new uncertainty. If I were to characterize the last 40 years of sort of the policy environment for Brazil, I'd say it's been generally favorable. Again, the last 3 or 4 years is the exception to that, I'd say. And that's because of this cap on gasoline prices that's imposed by the Brazilian government. So this is done in a bid to control inflation, the Brazilian government setting the price of gasoline. And you can see that, if I was to take this diagram back, say, to the early 2000s, you'd see that over the long term, the price set by Brazil tends to track the oil price. But what ended up happening is that between early 2011 and November 2014, so you had a pretty long sustained period of, over 3 years of this, over 3 years of the Brazilian gas price being below what would otherwise be determined by free market forces, and ultimately resulting in less money going back to Brazilian millers. And in a way that these policies couldn't have been introduced, or this period of low gas prices couldn't have come at a worse time for the Brazilian sector, because it happened to come on the tail of a period of rapid expansion. Between 2006 2008, there was a construction boom in Brazilian cane mills, and a lot of these mills were smaller, sort of in a more tenuous position, operating in areas that were less suitable agronomically, and also funded largely on debt. So they were very vulnerable facilities, and not well positioned to sort of weather the storm of low prices. Meanwhile, in the face of low prices, they've also struggled with increasing costs. If you look at this diagram over the last 12 years, you see essentially a doubling of Brazil's cost of production. It's been a number of factors that have been behind this increase. Labor costs have certainly been a big one. They've increased by something like 2-fold over the observed time frame. Capital costs are up somewhere between 2- and 3-fold. That's due in part to this proliferation of smaller mills. also to reduce throughput, which in the way we model costs translates to higher capital costs on a sort of a sugar or ethanol, per unit of sugar or per unit of ethanol. Metrics in the field, in the Brazilian cane fields, have also been pretty poor. If you look at the average cane yields in Brazil over the last 3 years and compare them with the early part of the 2000s, they're actually down 2.5% over that 12 or 13-year period. And I'm not just cherry picking single years here, but taking averages just to eliminate that possibility of one bad year sort of throwing the data. But you can imagine the alarm that I think the corn industry would have in the U.S. if they faced that kind of situation of absolutely no increase in corn yields, let alone a decline as they've seen in Brazil. TCTS, which is a sugar industry term, it just stands for tons of cane per tons of sugar, and it's a reflection of both the sucrose content of the cane as well as the miller's ability to extract that cane. The higher the TCS, the more tons of cane per tons of sugar, which is bad. So that TCTS has actually increased 7% during the same period. So again, two really poor metrics for the Brazilian cane industry, and ultimately translating into reduced throughput for their mills. So with these mills being squeezed essentially on both sides, flat prices for their product and lower costs, you've seen that there's been this rapid reversal of fortune for the sector. I mentioned that there was this period of rapid expansion. You sort of see the tail end of that in this diagram, illustrated by the blue bars, which are the greenfield developments in Brazil. And then that sort of ebbs in around 2010, 2011, giving away to mill closures in the beginning part of this decade. So between 2007, 2009, what the net effect of this was the loss of 65 mills in Brazil. The addition of 65 mills in Brazil. Between 2012 and 2014, the industry lost 27 of those mills. And again, a lot of these mills were smaller mills, financed with debt. Many of them were also ethanol-only mills. So those mills that have a granulated sugar end tend to be older, better positioned, better financed. But these ethanol-only mills were again in a pretty tight spot. On the export front, Brazil hasn't gotten any relief there either. Exports have fallen over the past 3 years, both in absolute terms and relative to the size of the crop. And the big story here is Brazil's shipments to the U.S. U.S. once constituted something like 75% of Brazil's export market, or as recently as 2012 constituted 75% of Brazil's export market. And today it's half, or maybe slightly less than half. And I'd say this is largely something, a recurring theme I've noticed in the presentations thus far has been the uncertainty surrounding RFS and how that makes it difficult to invest in the sector, and it has obvious negative impacts on the Brazilian industry as well. They've just been less apt to send product to the U.S. with this uncertainty. If you look at some other regions, U.S. corn ethanol has been out-competing Brazilian ethanol in Central America and the Caribbean. Shipments to Europe and the Middle East are down, thanks in large part to competitive production out of Europe, which is a reflection of same forces that have reduced corn costs here in the U.S. have led to lower grain costs in Europe. Asian demand, which is heavily weighted toward potable ethanol, particularly in Japan, and they like the non-GMO aspects of cane ethanol, that's remained fairly steady during the observed time frame. One thing that we do quite a bit of at LMC is modeling costs of production, and we do this in two different ways. I mean, we'll occasionally work with clients, and they'll open up all their books to us and say, we want you to compute to the dime what it is, what our cost of production is, and sort of compare us to some of our competitors. There's some obvious advantages of that because you can get very accurate in terms of their costs, but there's also some disadvantages in that it's very hard to benchmark costs across different businesses. People sort of keep their books in different ways. And also, not to mention the problem that we run into confidentiality agreements. We can't share that kind of explicit information across the industry. So the approach that we typically take is an engineering cost model approach. And maybe that's just a fancy way of saying, we look at the cost of building a new facility, look at depreciation, maintenance, prevailing labor rates, input costs, performance in the field, those kinds of things to come up with a picture of the costs that way. And that's what I've illustrated in these two diagrams, the one on the left being sort of a reflection of costs and margins for the U.S. corn ethanol industry, and then comparing that on the right with costs and margins for the Brazilian cane ethanol industry. And I guess just a couple of points I'd make is that Brazilian processing costs tend to be lower than those in the U.S. Brazil benefits from a processing standpoint from cogen, which helps keep costs low for mills that have it. But total costs in the U.S., including the costs of raw material and any kind of credit they get back for byproducts, have been below those of Brazil for the last couple of years. So this, coupled with the lower ethanol prices that are prevailing in Brazil, have meant that on average, the Brazilian ethanol industry has been less profitable than the U.S. since 2011. But again, not to be too hard on Brazil, I just wanted to sort of expand that coverage a bit and include some other countries. This diagram is a little bit confusing. The blue and the green bars that's stacked together, that's probably what you should focus on. That would be total costs of production using this engineering cost model for ethanol based on these various feedstocks in various countries in 2013. And you can see that both Brazilian cane and U.S. corn rank pretty well on that cost curve. The problem being that ethanol prices in both countries are relatively low compared to, say, a group like the EU, which benefits, which prices or get some protection from tariffs and that kind of thing. So sort of looking ahead, focusing the discussion on what the outlook is for the Brazilian sector going forward, I mentioned early on that there's opportunity for Brazil to make some immediate improvements. And certainly they're going to continue to face pressure from rising input prices, particularly labor, in the near term. But there is some things they could do immediately to reduce their costs. One would be a yield recovery, and this is a rebalancing of the cane crop. So for those of you who aren't familiar with sugarcane and its agronomy, in Brazil it's typically grown on sort of a five-year ratoon cycle. So you have plant cane and then 4 or 5 harvests after that. What we've seen is that with the indebtedness of the industry and these guys not making any money, they've been very slow to replant cane. So what you see is an aging of the cane stands in Brazil, and as cane gets older, yields fall. So that's certainly been a contributing factor to the lower yields and higher costs. There's also some efficiency improvements that the industry could make, and I would just make the point that the yield recovery is probably the more difficult of these two goals to achieve, because that takes cash, and as we know, a lot of the Brazilian mills don't have it right now. The efficiency improvements, on the other hand, are more of a learning curve thing, and something that these guys should be making progress toward relatively quickly. Just to give you a couple examples of what kind of efficiency improvements I'm talking about, I've got a table down here looking both at seed cane usage and harvester productivity. Sugar cane, they grow their own seed. They set aside a certain amount of acres to grow cane, and that cane is billeted and used as seed for the next year's crop. In Florida, just to give you a sense, about 4% of cane acreage is used for seed cane. In Brazil, it's closer to 10 or 11%. And so that's cane that they have to fertilize, they have to spray for it, they have to treat it, and that costs money and obviously has costs associated with it. So you want to keep your seed cane usage down. Brazil's not doing that, but you can see that there's room to cut that in half once they sort of get through some of the growing pains associated with mechanization. Harvester productivity. Brazil made a commitment a while back of eliminating burning in sugarcane by 2017, and as part of that, they've had to shift to a mechanized harvest. When you harvest cane by hand, manual harvest, you have to burn it prior in order to facilitate the harvest process. But when so if you want a green harvest, you really have to harvest mechanically. And these numbers below just give you a sense of how Brazilian harvester productivity stacks up against Australia and Florida. So that they're harvesting on average 500 metric tons of cane per day, whereas Australia and Florida it's maybe closer to 800. This just gives you a sense of if they were to implement those goals, what would be the net effect for the industry. The blue line there is a supply curve, a cost curve for sugarcane for 2014-15. Each one of the horizontal components of that curve represent a different geography of Brazilian cane production, a different level of sort of technical performance. So, and by that I mean what kind of boilers are they using? Do they have cogen? These sorts of things. The red line below that represents what their cost curve could look like if they were to implement these changes. And then that green horizontal line is what the hydrous ethanol price was in Brazil for 2014. So you can see that, where they stand today, most of the industry is producing ethanol above the cost at which they can sell it for. So not a good situation. But if they were to implement these changes, most of the industry could then sort of shift into a profitable position. Now, the observant among you might say, hey, where's your y-axis? That was left off intentionally because we sell this information, and my boss only agreed to let me use this on the condition that I leave that out. Another sort of, bit of good news on the horizon for the Brazilian ethanol sector is things that have emerged in the last couple of months. The government's announced both an increase in gasoline taxes and also raised the ethanol blend from 25% to 27%. Beginning with the gas tax increase, it's been increased something like 22 cents. This is through an increase in pisco-fins and a reinstatement in their CDE tax has been increased by 22 centavos a liter. Which at the pump, which after some regional taxes and things are taken into account, equates to about 26 centavos per liter at the pump. And by our estimates, this should help prop up ethanol prices by 10% or so. So, very welcome news for the industry. But certainly not going to be, not enough to, I think, make an immediate, not going to be an immediate salve for those industries that were heavily indebted and continue to struggle. I mean, this is a step in the right direction, but you're still going to see more and more consolidation in the industry. On the blending side, this result, if Dilma signs it through, would result in the immediate increase of domestic anhydrous demand by roughly 250 million gallons. And just to put that in perspective, 2014 exports by Brazil were just 366 million gallons. So a pretty sizable chunk. Also, the increase in this ethanol blend, it will tighten the market for anhydrous, and that'll allow the price of ethanol to sort of gravitate upward toward the price of gasoline. And then there's also been some movements on behalf of the states. Minas Gerais, which is where cane is an important industry and which accounts for 6 to 7% of Brazilian hydrous consumption. They increased the ICMS tax, which is an interstate tax. They increased that for gasoline while reducing it to ethanol, so that will also boost demand. So there's a number of policy measures that have been implemented in the last couple months that should help the industry take a step in the right direction. So I guess these last two slides, could be characterized as sort of the key conclusions of the presentation. When I was going over this data, it just seemed like there's so many things sort of stacked against Brazil right now. And I think this diagram kind of summarizes some of the points that we've addressed over the course of the presentation. And in summary, it appears that the window for Brazil to sell into the U.S. has gotten a bit narrower. Well, it seems that the opportunities for U.S. to sell into Brazil have increased. So what I've illustrated here is just look at the convergence of the RIN prices. And then you see that Brazilian ethanol in the U.S. continues to be higher priced than U.S. corn ethanol, and that convergence of RIN prices has sort of put Brazilian cane ethanol in direct competition with corn ethanol. But the obvious move for a refiner is to go with the cheaper product. So corn ethanol in the U.S. will continue to win out. When I asked some of my colleagues who follow biofuel sectors or whose sole focus is biofuels, where they see Brazilian exports to the U.S. headed in 2015, the general consensus seems to be certainly not more than what it was this past year, and probably on par with it, and most likely slightly less. Meanwhile, the news for U.S. producers hoping to export to Brazil is decidedly better. What we're forecasting right now, there's a lot of signals that the Brazilian cane crop has taken a turn for the worse. There's been a drought there recently, so the amount of cane and ultimately fermentable sugars or recoverable sugars is going to be could be down relative to last year, and certainly down relative to initial projections. And all sort of forecasts point to ethanol supply in Brazil being pretty tight by the end of 2015. So there's going to be a need for ethanol in Brazil. And again, this point of I hate to harp on the same point, but it's an encouraging one, at least with cheap corn here in the U.S. And relatively high gasoline prices in Brazil. There's certainly opportunities for U.S. producers to make money through those sales. when a couple folks at the conference asked me, what about volumes? What do you see in terms of volumes of U.S. product going to Brazil? I mean, it's hard to say. I think the economic signals are there to support far more than what could be sort of justified or supported politically. I mean, we see something like 200 million liters perhaps per quarter, which translates into about 220 gallons per year. We have an office in Piracicaba, which is sort of in the heart of cane country in Brazil. And the conventional wisdom coming out of them is that any ethanol exports by the U.S. to Brazil above that level might prompt the Brazilian government to sort of revisit some of these policies and perhaps take a step back, dialing back on the blending rates and that kind of thing. So there's room, but there's also some political roadblocks that need to be overcome as well. And so I was told to leave 5 minutes for questions, and we got slightly less than that, but I know we're behind schedule as well. So.
Thank you, Owen. We do have a couple minutes for questions if there is anybody that has one. If you want to come to the microphone while people make their ways to the microphone, I'll just tee you up with this one. You got through a discussion about Brazil's oil market and their situation without mentioning Petrobras and the current scandal. I'd be curious as to if you have a view as to whether or not that whole thing is played out, if it is going to have further ramifications, if there are political consequences for President Rousseau, and what you think that might have in terms of any impact on the oil markets there.
Well, I think what we're likely to see is a further sort of degradation in the boundary between Petrobras as a state-owned company and the Brazilian government. With this scandal, I'm sure there's been a loss of trust. And what you're likely to see is sort of more power, I think, sort of reclaimed by the Brazilian government. I think, in a lot of cases, it's almost a mistake to treat Petrobras as a separate entity because they are controlled by the government. And I think it's right to assume that the high-level decisions made there are ultimately sort of dictated by the Brazilian government.
So will there be political consequences for Rousseau?
That I don't know. I can't say. I read the tea leaves on Brazilian politics. I mean, she seems to be very popular with her constituency. I mean, the business side, and certainly ethanol has never been. The business side has never been a huge proponent of Rousseff. So, this certainly doesn't help. But I can't say for sure.
Good question.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yep.
Good. I'm Doug Tiffany from the University of Minnesota, and I had some involvement in looking at the pricing of cane sugar a few years back. And I also wanted your opinion, since I'm a little bit out of date with Brazil, what has happened to development of their oil resources? There was lots written about their offshore reserves of oil. And I'm sure this is a big policy story in Brazil on the development. And has the investment taken place to develop those resources?
No, I was just looking at this morning actually, and I was surprised, partially surprised, I guess, to find out that Petrobras is the world's most indebted publicly traded company. I think a lot of the policies that Rousseff has implemented over the last couple of years, and even her predecessor, have been designed in part. I think there was a lot of misguided policies, but they were done with the intent of helping Petrobras's position. Not too long ago, Rousseff was sort of bragging about Brazil's upcoming energy independence, but without a profitable company, they've really not been able to invest in the pre-sal as the previous level of enthusiasm might have suggested.
Okay. Owen, thank you very much. It was a very interesting discussion.
Thanks again, Bob. Appreciate it.
Thank you.